So now what I want to show you is how to do the proper setup of the camera in software. So initially all we did was control the amount of light that was hitting the camera and set the camera for its lowest shutter and gain settings. But once you start looking at dimmer samples, you're going to need to take advantage of all the software control of the camera. So what I've done is I've put in a different sample here, and but left all the settings the same as when I had the USAF test target in. And you'll notice that what's happened here is that the screen has now gone dark, right? I still have the leftover image of the test target, but there's nothing in the screen. So the thing that you want to do whenever you're working with a sample, the first thing you do is try and increase the light level to the point where you can see something, unless you're concerned about bleaching. So in this case, we're not. This is just a random test sample, so I'm going to turn the light so you pick up a little bit of gray. I'm turning down the neutral density, so I'm increasing the intensity on the sample. And as I do that, I'm getting more. Now see, I've started to pick up a little bit of saturation. Now, you can also tell that I'm out of focus, so I'm not worrying too much about the saturation right now. What I'm going to do is focus using the same knob, and this is just a paper sample. And now it's a little hard to tell if I'm well focused, but notice that there's also more red. When you get into better focus, you're often collecting more light, so things will look brighter. So I'm going to adjust, oops, wrong way. Here we go, I've got a good grayscale. So I'm going to adjust my focus here till I can see the fibers. Now, what I'm going to do now is put in some of the filters to make things even dimmer, and I'll let you figure out some of the other things that are happening in this experiment. That's part of what you're doing in the lab. But I'm going to put in the excitation filter and the emission filter. And again, you'll see things have gone now completely black again. So what I want to do at this point is make sure that I've got as much light as possible. So I'm going to turn down the neutral densities all the way to 0. I have no gray filters in, but things are still black. So what I'm going to do now, so I'm going to come over here, and you see the crosshairs. And remember, when I put them up over here and did a normal left click, that set my shutter and gain to 0. I've just clicked again. See, my gain is 0. My shutter, I guess my shutter is 6, which is as low as it goes. And this is just a captured image, right? It only updates when I click. If I start moving down the y-axis and clicking, that will increase the shutter time on the camera. Longer the shutter time, the more light it can collect. So I can keep moving down. The shutter time is longer and longer. And as I move far enough down, you'll see that I start picking up some red here. And if I come all the way down, I can turn my shutter to the max. You'll notice here it took a while to update. Sometimes if you click and you lose the crosshairs, you actually need to wait for the software to update. If you keep clicking, you'll just crash the software and have to restart it. Now I have my shutter at 3196. I've got a fair amount of saturation, and that's fine. When you're using the camera, the first thing you want to do is turn up your light so that you have sort of as much intensity as you need without saturating the camera. However, if that's not enough, you'll start increasing the shutter time. The longer the shutter time, the more essentially photons you're collecting in each pixel, and the better your signal to noise will be. If that's still not enough, if the sample was still, for instance, gray at this point, I'm just going to slide it over a little bit, and you can see now here, sample's still just gray, but I can start moving along the x-axis, and as I do that, I start to pick something up again. And it's a little out of focus, so I'm going to adjust my focus here. But as I move along the x-axis, and I'm going to move all the way to the edge here, now I've got my gain at 512, which is its maximum. The shutter is its maximum, and I've got a certain amount of saturation. And the thing that's important here is you want to increase your light first, then your shutter time, and after that your gain. And the reason for that is that by increasing the light and then increasing the shutter, the best thing to say is by increasing the light, you increase the number of photons, signal photons you get, which is what you want to do. You want to see an image from signal. by increasing the shutter time, you're capturing more photons. Even if they're not allotted any given time, you have more time to capture them. But there is some dark noise, some noise that's sort of always present as long as you have the camera shutter open. So longer shutter is a little bit noisier. And then if image is still not particularly bright, then what you want to do is you want to start increasing the gain. And the gain is just multiplying your image by something. So it doesn't help your signal to noise at all. So you don't want to increase the gain first. You want to increase the shutter time first, because it will give you as good signal to noise as you're going to get from the sample with the illumination you have. Then increase gain just to scale it as close to you as you can get to saturation. The reason you want to be close to saturation, the reason you want to have some red in an image, and here I'm going to turn down my gain a little bit until I have relatively little red in the image, just a little. And I want enough red in the image to tell me that my brightest things are just barely saturating. That means that I know I'm filling all of the gray levels of the camera. This camera happens to have 256 gray levels. And I want to know that I'm making full use of them. Because if I'm only, say, using 2 gray levels, my image will be binary. It will look very pixelated. There'll be only, something equivalent to black and something equivalent essentially to gray. And what I would like to do is have a whole lot of fine gradations of intensity that I can detect. The only way I can do that is to use the full dynamic range of the camera, which means that the brightest thing has to be just hitting the maximum digital signal it can put out. I want to essentially scale to make the best use of my analog to digital converter. So I'm scaling when I have just a little bit of red in my image. It means I'm just saturating a little bit. That means that my brightest things are actually at the maximum intensity the camera can handle. That's good. And then you'll notice in these areas in between, things are sort of a light gray. And the question is, well, how can I get those areas? I want the darkest thing in my image ideally to be completely black. And the only way to do that is to reduce the ambient light that's hitting the sample. And you can actually see, if I just take a piece of paper and I put it over, you'll see that the whole image gets darker. I'm just blocking some room light from getting into the lenses. So clearly there's a lot of room light that's getting in there. The best way to solve this problem is to take the top and put that on the box. And at that point you'll see suddenly the whole image becomes much darker. And what that tells you is, in part, a lot of what we were seeing was actually not actually due to the lamp that we have in the box, but just due to ambient light in the room. It's the room light, sunlight coming into the window. Since everything's much darker now, I'm going to actually turn my gain way back up. And you'll see that even with my gain at maximum at this point, I still have relatively little intensity here. It's still very hard to see anything. But the good thing about this is that the brightest things here will still be as bright as I can make them, and the darkest things will be as dark as the opacity of this box will allow. And that's the way that you want to do the camera settings. So again, whenever, and I'll use a last example here. I'm going to scoot this back over to a different section of the sample, which is quite bright, so I'm going to turn it down a bit. And it's a little out of focus. And what I'd say is, one thing you may want to consider is that you often have to refocus when you change the wavelengths that you're working with. So if you change a filter in, you might naturally expect that the optics focus a little differently, and you'll have to make an adjustment here. And so I'll refocus. I'm going to put actually, I'll show you here. I'm going to turn my gain down, and then it looks like I can turn the shutter down a little bit. Notice I have to wait. Now it's updated again. Now I'll keep turning the shutter down till, there we go. There's just a little bit of red floating around, which is what you want, just a little bit. Background is fairly dark, but if I cover things with the box, then the background gets even better. And I may be able to readjust the gain just a little bit for a nice image. So that's how you make the best use of sort of both your lamp, your shutter, and then your gain settings for the camera.